The rope didn't break when they threw it over the barn beam, and that's what Naomi Vale would remember most. Not the laughter, not the way her father's hand shook when he pushed her forward, but the solid, terrible certainty of that knot holding fast. In Dry Hollow, debts got paid one way or another, and on this blistering afternoon in the Wyoming Territory, Samuel Vale had decided his daughter's body was currency enough. The crowd gathered like vultures circling carrion, waiting to see which man would claim her. But when Talon Gray stepped forward, everything Naomi thought she knew about her worth shattered like sun-scorched glass. If you're watching from anywhere in this world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Naomi's story travels. Hit that like button and stay until the end, because what happens next will change everything. The heat in Dry Hollow didn't just beat down. It pressed into skin like a branding iron, relentless and mean. Naomi Vale stood in the center of the town square with sweat rolling down her spine, darkening the fabric of her worn calico dress in patches that spread like shame across her broad back. Dust coated her boots, her hands, the hem of her skirt. Dust and the weight of every eye in town. Her father stood 3 feet away, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on him even through the scorched air, but he wouldn't look at her. Samuel Vale kept his gaze fixed somewhere past the livery stable, his jaw working like he was chewing words too bitter to spit out. His shirt hung loose on a frame that had gone from powerful to gaunt over the past 2 years, and his hands, those hands that had once swung a hammer with authority, trembled against his thighs. "This is horseshit, Sam." Buck Thornton's voice carried across the square, loud enough to make the horses at the hitching post shift and snort. He was a thick-necked man who ran the general store and half the gambling debts in town, and right now his face had gone red enough to match the kerchief around his throat. "You owe me $300 in hard coin. I ain't taking no. You'll take what's offered, or you'll take nothing." The voice that cut through Buck's bluster was cooler, quieter, and it belonged to Martin Cresswell, who owned the land office and most of the property deeds in the county. He stood in the shade of the surveyor's office overhang, one boot propped against the wall, arms crossed over a vest embroidered with a watch chain that caught the light. "Sam's offering a settlement. That's more than most men get when they're drowning." Naomi's throat tightened. Settlement. As if she were a plot of land to be divided, a disputed claim to be resolved with paperwork, and a handshake. "She ain't worth $300. This came from somewhere in the crowd. Naomi couldn't see who'd said it, but she heard the snickers that followed, the agreement that rippled through the gathered men like wind through dry grass. "Look at the size of her. You'd have to feed her like a plow horse just to keep her upright." More laughter. Naomi kept her eyes on the dirt between her boots, on the small rocks and scattered wood shavings from the carpenter's shop across the way. Her hands hung at her sides, thick-fingered and work-rough, and she curled them into fists so tight her nails bit crescents into her palms. This was not the first time she'd been weighed and found wanting. In a town where women were measured by the smallness of their waists and the delicacy of their hands, Naomi had always been wrong, too tall, too broad, too sturdy. Her hips were wide, her shoulders strong, her body built for labor rather than ornament. She'd spent 23 years learning to make herself smaller in every way that mattered, and now here she stood, made spectacle, while men debated her value like livestock at auction. "I'll take her." The voice was new, and it silenced the square like a thunderclap. Naomi's head came up. So did her father's. So did every other head in Dry Hollow, all of them turning toward the man who'd spoken. He stood at the edge of the crowd, just beyond the shade of the blacksmith's awning. Tall and lean, with dark hair that fell past his shoulders and skin the color of aged cedar, he looked like something carved from the mountains themselves. Sharp angles, hard lines, no softness anywhere. He wore canvas trousers and a shirt the faded gray of old smoke, and his eyes, when they swept across the gathering, were the color of flint. Talon Gray. Naomi knew of him, the way everyone in Dry Hollow knew of him, though few knew him well. He kept a small ranch south of town, raised horses that were worth twice what any other man could get, and came into Dry Hollow only when necessity demanded it. He was Lakota, half, some said, or maybe more, and that alone would have made him an outsider. But it was the way he carried himself that truly set him apart. The stillness, the watchfulness, the sense that he moved through the world on terms no one else could dictate. Buck Thornton spat into the dirt. "The hell you will." Talon's gaze shifted to Buck, steady and unblinking. You want your money or not? I want my money from Sam, not from some half-breed squatter who... $300. Talon's voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen, but it cut through Buck's bluster like a knife through canvas. Cash. Today. That square the debt? Martin Cresswell pushed off from the wall, his expression shifting from detached amusement to calculation. You got that kind of money, Gray? I got it? Then why the hell would you spend it on her? Someone called from the crowd, and again came the laughter, cruel and easy. Talon didn't answer. He stepped forward, moving through the gathered men with a fluid grace that made them part without realizing they were doing it, and he stopped directly in front of Naomi. Up close, she could see the fine scars that traced his hands, the silver that glinted at his temples, the lines carved beside his mouth by sun and wind and years. He looked at her the way a man might study the horizon, searching, assessing, but not judging. You want to leave this place? He asked. Naomi's breath caught. No one had asked her what she wanted. Not today. Not ever. She tried to speak and found her throat closed tight. She managed a nod instead, small and jerky. Then come with me. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a claim. It was an offer, extended like a rope to someone drowning, and Naomi felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been sealed shut so long she'd forgotten it was there. Now hold on just a damn minute. Samuel Vale finally moved, stepping between Naomi and Talon with a belligerence that smelled like desperation and cheap liquor. This here's a business arrangement. You don't just walk off with what? Talon's gaze shifted to Samuel, and the temperature in the square seemed to drop 10 degrees. Your daughter? The one you just tried to sell to pay your debts? You think you got a claim on her now? Samuel's mouth worked, but no sound came out. His face had gone patchy, red and white in uneven blotches, and his hands shook harder. You got no right, he finally managed. She's my blood. My kin. You can't just... I'm not taking her. Talon's voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the square. I'm paying your debt. What she does after that is her choice, not yours, not mine, not any man's here. The silence that followed was absolute. Naomi could hear the creak of the saloon sign swinging in the hot wind, the distant hammer of the blacksmith's forge, the rasp of her own breathing. Martin Cresswell cleared his throat. Gray, you understand what you're proposing here is highly irregular. The arrangement was Sam owed money and couldn't pay. Talon pulled a leather pouch from his belt and tossed it to Buck Thornton, who caught it reflexively. Count it, 300, debt's cleared. Buck opened the pouch, his thick fingers fumbling with the drawstring, and spilled coins into his palm, gold eagles and silver dollars that gleamed in the harsh sunlight. His expression shifted from hostility to greed so quickly it would have been comical if Naomi's entire future hadn't been hanging in the balance. It's all here, Buck said slowly, as if the words pained him. Then we're done. Talon looked at Naomi again, and this time she saw something in his eyes that made her chest tighten. Not pity, not desire, but recognition, as if he knew exactly what it felt like to stand in the center of a circle of judgment and find yourself wanting. You coming or staying? The question hung in the air like smoke. Naomi looked at her father. Samuel wouldn't meet her eyes. He never did. Not really. Not when he was sober enough to feel ashamed, and not when he was drunk enough to need someone to blame. She'd spent her whole life trying to be small enough not to burden him, quiet enough not to provoke him, useful enough to justify the space she took up in his house and at his table. And still, in the end, he'd brought her here. To this. She looked at the crowd, at the faces she'd known since childhood, the women who'd taught her to sew and cook and keep her opinions locked behind her teeth, the men who'd never once seen her as anything but Sam Vale's disappointing daughter, too big to be pretty and too quiet to be interesting. They were waiting for her to choose, waiting to see if she'd be brave or broken. For the first time in her life, Naomi chose herself. I'm coming. Her voice came out rougher than she'd intended, scraped raw by fear and something that might have been hope, but it was loud enough, clear enough. Talon nodded once, a sharp dip of his chin, and turned toward the edge of town. Naomi fell into step behind him, her legs moving before her mind could catch up, before the fear could root her in place. She could feel the stairs following her, could hear the murmur of voices rising like disturbed hornets, but she didn't look back. She didn't look back when her father called her name, once, hoarse and desperate. She didn't look back when Buck Thornton shouted something crude about buyer's remorse. She didn't look back when the laughter started again, because this time it wasn't pinning her in place. This time she was walking away from it. They reached the edge of the square, where the buildings gave way to open scrubland and the road split toward the ranches and homesteads scattered across the territory. Talon had a horse waiting, a tall bay gelding with intelligent eyes and a saddle worn smooth by years of use. He swung up into the saddle with an ease that spoke of a lifetime on horseback, then reached down, offering his hand. Naomi hesitated. She'd ridden before, but never like this. Never behind a man she didn't know, never toward a future she couldn't see. "You change your mind, you can walk back right now," Talon said. No shame in it. But there would be shame in it. There would be shame and laughter and a father who'd already proven what he thought she was worth. Naomi took Talon's hand. His grip was strong, calloused, and he pulled her up behind him with a strength that made it seem effortless. She settled onto the horse's back, her skirts bunching awkwardly around her legs, and gripped the saddle's cantle because she didn't know where else to put her hands. Talon clicked his tongue, and the horse moved forward at a steady walk. The town of Dry Hollow fell away behind them, growing smaller and smaller until it was nothing but a smudge of buildings against the vast, indifferent landscape. They rode in silence for an hour, maybe more. The sun climbed higher, turning the air into something thick and punishing. Sweat soaked through Naomi's dress, plastered her hair to her neck, made her shift uncomfortably on the horse's back. Her thighs ached from gripping the animal's sides, and her hands cramped around the saddle leather, but she didn't complain. Complaining was a luxury she'd learned long ago she couldn't afford. Finally, Talon spoke. "There's water in the canteen on the saddle. Help yourself." Naomi fumbled for the canteen, her fingers clumsy with heat and nerves. She unscrewed the cap and drank deeply. The water was warm and tasted faintly of metal, but it was the best thing she'd ever had. She capped it and hung it back on the saddle, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "Thank you," she said quietly. Talon didn't respond. The silence stretched out again, but it felt different now, less hostile, more companionable. Naomi watched the landscape roll past, the scrub brush and sage, the distant mountains shimmering in the heat haze, the occasional hawk circling overhead. It was harsh country, unforgiving and raw, but there was a beauty in it too, a kind of terrible honesty that made no promises and told no lies. "Why did you do that?" The question tumbled out before Naomi could stop it. "Back there. Why did you pay for me?" Talon was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Because no one should be bought." Simple words. Absolute. "They'll talk about you," Naomi said. "About this. It'll follow you." "Let it." "And me? What about you?" Naomi's throat worked. "What do you want from me?" Talon glanced back over his shoulder, and for the first time she saw something that might have been the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "I want you to figure out what you want. Everything else will work out as it comes." They rode until the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Talon finally pulled the horse to a stop near a shallow creek that wound through a stand of cottonwoods. The trees offered the first real shade Naomi had seen in hours, and the sound of running water was almost obscenely beautiful after the dry silence of the trail. Talon dismounted and helped Naomi down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground. Hours on horseback had left her stiff and shaking, but she locked her knees and stayed upright through sheer stubbornness. Talon led the horse to the creek to drink, leaving Naomi standing in the dappled shade, trying to convince her body it was safe to relax. She watched him tend to the horse, checking its hooves, running his hands along its legs, murmuring to it in a language she didn't recognize but that sounded like water over stones. There was a gentleness in the way he moved, a patience that felt almost foreign after years of her father's abrupt, angry gestures. When the horse was settled, Talon pulled a bundle from the saddlebag and tossed it to Naomi. She caught it awkwardly, nearly dropping it, and unwrapped the cloth to find hard biscuits, dried meat, and a wedge of cheese. "Eat," Talon said. "We've got another hour of riding before we stop for the night." Naomi's stomach twisted at the sight of food, not from hunger, though she was hungry, but from the old, familiar shame that came with eating. Her father's voice echoed in her head. "You don't need that. Look at you. You've had enough for 3 women already." She'd learned to eat in secret, in small amounts, to make herself as unobtrusive in her appetite as she tried to be in every other way. But Talon wasn't watching her with judgment or disgust. He wasn't watching her at all. He was crouched by the creek, refilling the canteen, his attention on the water and the darkening sky. Naomi bit into the biscuit. It was hard enough to hurt her teeth, but the taste was good, simple and honest. She ate slowly, mechanically, until the food was gone and her stomach felt like it might actually believe it was allowed to be full. They mounted up again as the light began to fail. The temperature dropped with the sun, and Naomi found herself grateful for the chill after the brutal heat of the day. Talon guided the horse along a trail that wound through the scrubland, following landmarks only he could see. The darkness gathered around them like a cloak, and overhead the stars began to emerge, thousands of them, brilliant and cold and impossibly distant. When they finally stopped, it was in a small hollow sheltered by an outcropping of rock. Talon dismounted and began setting up camp with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. He unsaddled the horse, hobbled it where it could graze, gathered wood for a fire. Naomi tried to help, but she didn't know what to do, didn't know where to step or what to touch. And after the 3rd time she fumbled something he'd handed her, Talon just shook his head. "Sit," he said, not unkindly. "Rest." So she sat on a flat rock near the fire and watched him work. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp planes of his cheekbones, the deep-set eyes, the mouth that seemed carved from something harder than flesh. He moved with a quiet competence that made her feel even more useless than usual, and she hated it. Hated the helplessness, the dependency, the fact that she'd traded one kind of servitude for another. Except this didn't feel like servitude. Talon wasn't ordering her around or making demands. He was just doing what needed to be done, and he was letting her be. When the fire was built up and the coffee was brewing in a battered tin pot, Talon finally sat across from her and pulled out the last of the dried meat. He handed her a piece and kept one for himself, chewing slowly, staring into the flames. "You got people?" he asked after a while. "Besides your father?" Naomi shook her head. "My mother died when I was 12. No brothers or sisters. Just him." Talon nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "What about friends?" Naomi almost laughed, but it came out bitter. "In Dry Hollow? No, not really." "Why not?" The question was simple, but the answer was complicated. Because she'd never been the right kind of girl. Because her size made her a joke and her silence made her invisible. Because the women in town had their circles and their hierarchies, and Naomi had never figured out how to fit into them. Because loneliness was easier than rejection, and solitude was safer than shame. "I don't know," she said finally, because the truth was too big and too raw to put into words. Talon poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed her one. The metal was hot enough to sting her fingers, but she welcomed the pain. It was something to focus on that wasn't the knot of emotion building in her chest. "You know how to ride?" Talon asked. "A little." "How to shoot?" "No." "How to track, hunt, dress game?" Naomi's cheeks burned. "No." Talon sipped his coffee, his expression unchanged. "Then you're going to learn." "Why?" "Because where we're going, you'll need to." He met her eyes across the fire, and his gaze was steady, unflinching. "I'm not your father, Naomi. I'm not going to keep you like a bird in a cage, but I'm also not going to let you walk into the wilderness unprepared. You want to survive out here, you're going to have to be strong. And you already are. You just don't know it yet." Something shifted in Naomi's chest, some tectonic plate of belief grinding against another. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that she was weak and useless and everything her father had always said she was. But the words wouldn't come, and in their absence, she felt something else rising, something fragile and dangerous and terrifying. Hope. They slept that night on opposite sides of the fire, wrapped in blankets that smelled of horse and smoke. Naomi lay on her back, staring up at the stars, and felt the enormity of what she'd done settle over her like a weight. She'd left. She'd walked away from the only life she'd ever known, from the only home she'd ever had, and she'd followed a stranger into the wilderness based on nothing more than a promise and a feeling. It should have terrified her. And it did. But beneath the terror was something else, something bright and fierce and alive. For the first time in her life, Naomi had chosen, and whatever came next, that choice was hers. The next morning dawned cold and clear. Naomi woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Talon moving around the camp, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then it all came rushing back: the town, the debt, the horse, the fire, and she sat up quickly, her heart pounding. Talon glanced over at her. "Morning." "Morning?" she echoed, her voice rough with sleep. He handed her a cup of coffee and a biscuit left over from the night before. Naomi ate quickly, mechanically, trying to wake her body up and convince it that today was going to require more than it had given in years. They broke camp in silence, Talon packing up with the same brisk efficiency he'd shown the night before. When everything was secured on the horse, he turned to Naomi. "You're riding on your own today." Naomi blinked. "What?" "You heard me?" He gestured to the horse. "You're going to ride. I'll walk alongside, but you're in the saddle. I don't know how. I mean, I've ridden, but not like. Then you'll learn." Talon's voice was firm, but not harsh. "Can't have you depending on me for everything. You need to be able to move on your own." Naomi's hands shook as she approached the horse. The animal was tall, much taller than it had seemed when she was riding behind Talon, and it watched her with dark, liquid eyes that seemed far too intelligent for comfort. She reached for the saddle horn, trying to remember how she'd seen men mount, but her arms were too short and her body too heavy, and she couldn't pull herself up. She tried again, failed again. Heat flooded her face, the old shame rising like bile. "Here." Talon moved beside her, lacing his fingers together to form a step. "Foot here. I'll boost you." Naomi hesitated, then placed her boot in his hands. He lifted her effortlessly, and she swung her leg over the saddle, settling into the worn leather with a gracelessness that made her want to die. But she was up. She was mounted. Talon adjusted the stirrups, checked the reins, then stepped back. "Keep your heels down, your back straight. The horse knows what to do. You just need to not fight him. Understand?" Naomi nodded, gripping the reins so tightly her knuckles went white. "Relax," Talon said, and there might have been amusement in his voice, though his face remained impassive. "He can feel when you're tense. Makes him tense." Naomi tried to relax. It was like trying to relax while standing on the edge of a cliff. Talon clicked his tongue, and the horse started forward at a walk. Naomi lurched, grabbed the saddle horn, and somehow stayed seated. The world swayed and rocked beneath her, and her thighs burned from gripping the animal's sides. But she didn't fall. She didn't even scream. They traveled like that for hours. Talon walking beside the horse, Naomi clinging to the saddle and trying desperately not to embarrass herself further. The sun climbed, the heat returned, and the landscape stretched out in every direction, endless and unforgiving. Naomi's body ached in places she hadn't known could ache, and sweat soaked through her dress until the fabric clung to her like a second skin, but she didn't complain. Complaining would mean admitting weakness, and weakness was the one thing she couldn't afford. At midday, Talon called a halt near a scrubby stand of juniper. He helped Naomi dismount. Her legs nearly gave out when her feet hit the ground, and handed her the canteen. She drank deeply, the water warm and metallic, but blessedly wet. "You did good," Talon said. Naomi almost choked on the water. "I barely stayed on." "You stayed on, that's what matters." He pulled out more of the dried meat and biscuits, dividing them evenly between them. "Tomorrow you'll do better. Day after that, better still. That's how this works." They ate in silence, and Naomi tried to ignore the way her hands trembled and her shoulders screamed. When they were done, Talon stood and walked a short distance away, scanning the horizon with the same watchful intensity she'd noticed the day before. He moved like someone who expected danger, who never fully relaxed, and Naomi wondered what had taught him to be so careful. "Where are we going?" she asked when he returned. "My place. About 2 more days' ride south." "And then?" Talon's gaze was steady. "And then you decide what you want to do. You can stay, help with the ranch, learn what you need to learn, or you can move on, find somewhere else. But either way, you're not going back to Dry Hollow, not unless you choose to." The idea of choice, real choice, not the illusion of it, was so foreign that Naomi didn't know how to hold it. She turned it over in her mind like a strange object, examining it from every angle, trying to find the trap. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, because she still didn't understand. Talon was quiet for a long moment, then, "Because I know what it's like to be something people think they own." He didn't elaborate, and Naomi didn't push. Some stories she was learning took time to tell. They rode on through the afternoon, and as the hours passed, Naomi felt something shifting inside her, something subtle but undeniable. The pain in her muscles, the burn in her thighs, the ache in her lower back, all of it was proof that her body could do more than she'd ever asked of it, that she was stronger than the soft, useless thing her father had always told her she was. When they stopped for the night, Talon taught her how to unsaddle the horse, how to check its hooves for stones, how to hobble it so it could graze without wandering. His instructions were patient and precise, and he didn't get frustrated when she fumbled or forgot. He just showed her again and again, until her hands remembered what her mind couldn't quite hold. That night, as they sat by the fire, Naomi found herself talking. Not about anything important, just small things. The first time she'd seen snow, the way her mother used to hum while she sewed, the time she'd found a bird with a broken wing and tried to nurse it back to health, only to watch it die in her hands. Talon listened without interrupting, his face unreadable in the firelight, and when she finally fell silent, he nodded as if she'd said something profound. "You're braver than you think," he said quietly. Naomi didn't believe him, but she wanted to. The third day was harder. Naomi's body, which had been protesting since the moment she'd climbed into the saddle, decided it had finally had enough. Every muscle screamed, her back felt like it had been beaten with a plank, and the insides of her thighs were rubbed raw from the constant friction of the saddle leather. She gritted her teeth and kept riding, because the alternative, admitting she couldn't do it, was worse than the pain. Talon noticed. Of course he noticed. But he didn't offer to let her ride behind him again, didn't suggest they slow down or stop early. He just kept walking beside the horse, his stride steady and unhurried, and every so often he'd glance up at her with an expression that might have been encouragement or might have been assessment. By mid-afternoon, Naomi's vision was starting to blur at the edges. The heat, the pain, the exhaustion, all of it was piling up, and she could feel herself starting to sway in the saddle. She locked her knees, tightened her grip on the reins, and told herself she just had to make it a little longer, just a little longer. "We're stopping," Talon said. Naomi blinked, trying to clear her vision. "What?" "I said we're stopping. There's a creek up ahead. We'll make camp early today." "I'm fine," Naomi said automatically, even though she wasn't, even though every part of her was screaming for rest. Talon's mouth twitched. "I didn't say you weren't. I said we're stopping." They reached the creek 10 minutes later, a wider, deeper flow than the one they'd camped by the first night, bordered by willows and tall grass. Talon helped Naomi down from the horse, and this time when her legs gave out, he caught her before she hit the ground. "Easy," he said, steadying her. "You're all right." Naomi wanted to argue, to insist she was fine, but her body betrayed her. Her knees buckled, her hands shook, and when Talon guided her to sit on a fallen log, she sank down with a groan she couldn't suppress. "Stay there," he said, and went to tend to the horse. Naomi sat on the log and tried not to cry. She was so tired. Tired in her bones, tired in her soul, tired of hurting and struggling and proving herself to a world that had already decided she wasn't worth the effort. She wanted to lie down in the grass and sleep for a week. She wanted to go back to Dry Hollow and curl up in her small, familiar bed and pretend none of this had happened. Except she didn't. Not really, because as much as it hurt, as hard as this was, she was choosing it, and that made all the difference. When the horse was settled, Talon returned to the log and crouched in front of her. "You hurtin' bad?" Naomi nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Where?" "Everywhere," she managed. Talon's expression softened, just a fraction, but enough that Naomi saw it. "There's salve in the saddlebag, helps with the soreness, and the creek's cold enough to bring down the swelling if you soak for a bit. I don't," Naomi's voice cracked, "I don't know if I can do this. You're already doing it. It hurts." "I know." Talon stood, offering her his hand. "Come on, let's get you to the water." He led her to the creek's edge, where the willows offered shade and the grass grew thick and soft. Naomi sank down onto the bank, and Talon moved away to give her privacy. She pulled off her boots, blistered and swollen, and her stockings, which were stuck to her skin with sweat and blood. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she hiked her skirts up and lowered her legs into the water. The cold was a shock, sharp and immediate. But within seconds, the pain began to ease. Naomi closed her eyes and let the current flow over her calves, her ankles, her bruised and burning feet. It felt like absolution. She stayed there until the sun began to set, until the light turned golden and the shadows grew long. When she finally pulled herself out of the water, her legs felt almost human again, and the crushing exhaustion had receded to something merely bone deep. Talon had the fire going and coffee brewing when she returned to camp. He handed her a tin plate with beans and hardtack, and Naomi ate without tasting, too hungry to care what it was. "Tomorrow's the last day," Talon said. "We'll reach the ranch by evening." Naomi nodded. "And then?" "And then you rest. Heal up. Figure out what comes next." "What if I don't know what comes next?" Talon poured himself coffee, the steam rising in lazy spirals. "Then you take your time figuring it out. No rush. Eat." They sat in silence after that, and Naomi let herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe, possibly, she could do this. That maybe she was strong enough after all. That night she dreamed of her mother. Not the sick, wasted woman from the end, but the strong, laughing woman from before. The one who used to braid Naomi's hair and tell her stories about brave women who saved themselves. In the dream, her mother smiled and said, "You're doing just fine, girl. Keep going." When Naomi woke, the words stayed with her like a blessing. The ranch appeared on the fourth evening like a promise kept. Naomi saw it first as a dark smudge against the valley floor, then as distinct shapes, a cabin, a barn, corrals that caught the last of the daylight. The land here was different from the scrubland they'd crossed, greener and more forgiving, with a creek that ran year-round and cottonwoods that grew thick along its banks. Mountains rose to the west, their peaks still capped with snow, even in summer, and the valley stretched out before them like cupped hands offering shelter. Talon reined the horse to a stop at the top of the ridge, and Naomi felt him look back at her. "That's home," he said simply. "Home." The word settled into Naomi's chest with a weight she hadn't expected. She'd never had a home that was hers. Only her father's house where she'd existed on sufferance, taking up space she was constantly reminded she didn't deserve. This place, with its weathered buildings and wild grass, looked nothing like Dry Hollow's cramped respectability. It looked honest. It looked earned. They rode down into the valley as the sun touched the horizon, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. The horse knew it was close to rest and grain, and its pace quickened without Talon's urging. Naomi's body screamed in protest at the change in rhythm, but she held on, her hands cramped around the reins, her jaw set against the pain that had become her constant companion. When they reached the cabin, Talon dismounted and turned to help her down. Naomi's legs wouldn't hold her. 4 days in the saddle had seen to that, and she would have collapsed if Talon hadn't caught her. His hands were steady on her arms, his grip firm but not rough, and he held her upright until her knees remembered how to lock. "I've got you," he said quietly. "Just breathe." Naomi breathed, in and out, until the world stopped tilting quite so dramatically. "I can stand," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. Talon released her slowly, watchfully, ready to catch her again if she fell. But Naomi stayed upright through sheer stubbornness, her hand braced against the horse's warm flank, her weight on legs that shook but held. "Good," Talon said, and there was approval in his voice. "Wait here. I'll get the door." He strode to the cabin, a low structure built from rough-hewn logs and chinked with mud and grass. The door stuck in its frame, swollen from disuse, and Talon had to put his shoulder to it before it gave way with a groan. He disappeared inside, and a moment later yellow light spilled out into the gathering darkness. Lamplight, warm and welcoming. Naomi limped toward it like a moth to flame. Every step sent fresh pain shooting through her thighs and lower back, but she kept moving because the alternative was standing in the dark, and she'd done enough of that in her life. When she reached the threshold, she paused, suddenly uncertain. This was Talon's home, his private space, and she was an intruder here, brought by his choice, yes, but still fundamentally unwanted in the way all charity cases were unwanted. "Come in," Talon called from inside. "Don't stand out there like a stranger." Naomi stepped through the door, and into a single large room that served as kitchen, living area, and sleeping quarters all at once. It was spare but clean, with a stone fireplace at one end, a rough-built table and chairs, shelves lined with supplies, and a bed in the far corner piled with wool blankets and furs. The floor was packed dirt, swept smooth and hard, and the smell of wood smoke and leather hung in the air like incense. Talon was lighting a second lamp, his movements efficient and practiced. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "I'll get water heated for washing." Naomi sank into the chair and felt her body go boneless with relief. She hadn't realized how much energy it took to stay upright until she didn't have to anymore. Her eyes drifted closed, and for a moment she let herself simply exist without thought or fear or the need to prove anything to anyone. She must have dozed, because when she opened her eyes again, Talon had a fire going in the hearth and a pot of water heating over the flames. He'd changed out of his trail-dusty clothes into clean canvas trousers and a faded shirt, and his hair was damp as if he'd already washed. He caught her watching and nodded toward a door she hadn't noticed before, half hidden behind a curtain. "There's a room back there," he said. "Used to be storage, but I cleared it out on my last trip to town. Figured you'd want your own space." Naomi blinked. "You knew you were going to bring me here?" "I knew someone needed bringing." Talon poured the hot water into a basin and set it on the table along with a cloth and a sliver of soap. Dry Hollow's been eating people alive for years, only a matter of time before someone was ready to leave. "And you just happen to have $300 to spend on a stranger?" Talon's mouth quirked. "I had it. Whether I spent it on you or something else didn't much matter to me. Money's just a tool. You use it where it's needed." Naomi didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. She dipped the cloth in the water, gloriously hot after days of drinking from cold creeks, and began to wash her face. The dirt came away in brown streaks, revealing skin that felt raw and sunburned beneath. She washed her hands, her arms, the back of her neck, and with each stroke of the cloth, she felt layers of shame and exhaustion sloughing away. When she was done, Talon handed her a plate of food. Real food, not trail rations. Beans cooked with salt pork, cornbread still warm from the oven, and coffee so strong it could strip paint. Naomi ate slowly, savoring each bite, and tried not to think about how long it had been since someone had cooked for her without resentment or complaint. "The room's yours for as long as you need it," Talon said, sitting across from her with his own plate. "No expectations, no obligations. You want to stay and work the ranch? We'll figure out fair wages. You want to move on once you're healed up? I'll take you wherever you need to go." "Why?" The question burst out of Naomi before she could stop it. "Why are you being kind to me?" Talon chewed thoughtfully, his dark eyes steady on hers. "My mother was Lakota," he said after a moment. "My father was a trapper, white as they come. He loved her, I think, in his way, but when I was born looking too much like her and not enough like him, he decided I was a problem that needed solving. Tried to trade me to another tribe when I was 6, said I'd be better off with my own kind." Naomi's breath caught. "My mother stopped him," Talon continued, his voice even, as if he were recounting someone else's story. "Took me and left in the middle of winter. We lived in the mountains for 3 years, just the two of us, until she got sick. Fever took her in less than a week." He paused, looking down at his plate. "I was 9 years old and alone, and for a long time I thought I was worth exactly what my father said I was. Nothing. Took me years to learn different." "I'm sorry," Naomi whispered. "Don't be. It made me who I am." Talon met her eyes again. "Point is, I know what it's like to be treated like property, to have someone decide your value based on what they can get from you. And I decided a long time ago that if I ever had the chance to pull someone out of that particular kind of hell, I would." Naomi's throat tightened. "I don't know how to repay you. I don't want repayment. I want you to figure out who you are when no one's telling you you're not enough." Talon stood, collecting their empty plates. "That's all." He showed her to the back room, which was small but private, with a narrow bed, a wooden chest, and a window that looked out over the valley. Someone, Talon, she realized, had already brought in her few belongings from the saddlebag and laid them on the chest. It wasn't much, just a spare dress and some underthings she'd grabbed in her flight from Dry Hollow, but seeing them arranged carefully rather than thrown in a heap made something in her chest ache. Sleep as long as you need, Talon said from the doorway. Tomorrow we'll start figuring things out, but tonight, just rest. Naomi nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Talon pulled the door closed behind him, leaving her alone in the lamplight. She sat on the edge of the bed, which was stuffed with straw and surprisingly comfortable, and let herself cry for the first time since leaving Dry Hollow. Not loud, wrenching sobs, but silent tears that tracked down her face and dripped onto her hands. She cried for the girl she'd been, for the years she'd spent believing her father's cruelty was truth, for the mother she'd lost too soon, and the life she'd never thought she could have. When the tears finally stopped, Naomi felt hollowed out, but strangely lighter. She changed into her nightdress, blew out the lamp, and lay down in the darkness. Through the thin wall, she could hear Talon moving around the main room, banking the fire, settling in for the night. The sounds were domestic and strangely comforting, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Naomi fell asleep feeling safe. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee. Her body felt like it had been trampled by horses, every muscle stiff, every joint protesting. But there was also a strange sense of accomplishment beneath the pain. She'd survived the journey. She'd made it here. That counted for something. Naomi dressed slowly, her fingers clumsy with the buttons, and emerged from her room to find Talon already up and working. He glanced over from where he was frying eggs in a cast-iron skillet. "Morning. You sleep?" "Like the dead," Naomi admitted. "Good. Sit. Breakfast is almost ready." They ate together at the rough table, and this time Naomi didn't feel the old shame creeping up when she reached for a second helping. Talon noticed and said nothing, just pushed the pan of eggs closer so she could serve herself. It was such a small gesture, but it cracked something open inside her that had been sealed tight for years. After breakfast, Talon took her on a tour of the property. The ranch wasn't large by frontier standards, maybe 100 acres of decent grazing land, the cabin, the barn, and several corrals. But it was well maintained and thoughtfully arranged, every structure placed where it would do the most good. The horses, 3 mares, 2 geldings, and a yearling colt, were sleek and healthy, their coats gleaming in the morning sun. "I breed them for endurance and temperament," Talon explained as they leaned against the corral fence. "Sell mostly to the army and to ranchers who need reliable mounts. It's good money when the foals come out right." Naomi watched the horses move, their grace and power both foreign and fascinating. "How did you learn all this?" "Trial and error mostly. My mother's people were good with horses, and I watched them when I was young. The rest I picked up as I went." Talon's gaze was distant, focused on something only he could see. "I bought this land 7 years ago with money I'd saved from trapping and scouting. Built the cabin with my own hands. It's not much, but it's mine. No one can take it from me." The fierce pride in his voice was unmistakable, and Naomi understood it bone deep. This wasn't just a ranch, it was proof that he'd survived, that he'd built something solid out of the wreckage of his childhood. "I can sew," Naomi said suddenly. "Not just mending, but actual tailoring. My mother taught me before she died, and I've been making and altering clothes for people in Dry Hollow for years. I'm good at it." Talon turned to look at her. "That a skill you want to use?" "I don't know. Maybe." Naomi gripped the fence rail, the wood rough under her palms. "I just thought you should know I'm not completely useless." "Never said you were." Talon's voice was mild, but his eyes were sharp. "But if you've got a skill, we'll find a way to use it. There's always need for someone who can work a needle out here." They spent the rest of the morning working around the ranch. Talon showed Naomi how to muck out stalls, how to measure grain for the horses, how to check the fencing for weak points. Every task was explained patiently, demonstrated once, then handed over for her to try. Naomi fumbled and sweated and made mistakes, but Talon never lost his patience, never made her feel stupid for not knowing what he'd spent years learning. By midday, Naomi's hands were blistered and her back was screaming, but there was also a strange satisfaction in the work. She'd done something tangible, something that mattered, and the evidence was right there in the clean stalls and the fed horses. They ate lunch in the shade of the barn, bread and cheese and cold creek water, and Naomi found herself talking again, the words spilling out easier than they ever had before. She told Talon about her mother, about the quiet, gentle woman who taught her to find beauty in small things, and who died believing her daughter would find a better life than the one she'd had. She told him about her father's slow descent into bitterness and drink after her mother's death, about how he'd blamed Naomi for everything from the weather to his own failures. "He told me I ate too much," Naomi said, staring at the bread in her hands. "That I was costing him money just by existing, so I started eating less and then less. And he'd still find fault, so I just stopped. Stopped eating in front of him, stopped taking up space, stopped being." Talon was quiet for a long moment. "You know that was about him, not you." "I know that now. But knowing it doesn't make the voice in my head go away." Naomi looked up, meeting his eyes. "Every time I eat, I hear him telling me I'm greedy. Every time I speak up, I hear him telling me no one wants to listen. It's like he's still there, even though I left him behind." "He is still there," Talon said. "But he won't be forever. The voice gets quieter if you don't feed it. Takes time, but it happens." "How do you know?" "Because I had the same voice. Mine told me I was worth less because of who my mother was, because of what I looked like. Took me years to shut it up, and sometimes it still tries to come back. But I don't let it run my life anymore." He stood, brushing crumbs off his trousers. "Come on. I want to show you something." He led her to the barn's loft, where the afternoon sun slanted through gaps in the boards, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden light. Against one wall was a trunk, old and battered, with brass fittings gone green with age. Talon knelt beside it and lifted the lid, revealing carefully folded fabric, deerskin, wool, cotton, all in various colors and conditions. "These were my mother's," he said, running his hand over a piece of soft buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork. "She was a better hand with leather and cloth than anyone I've ever met. Made everything we wore, everything we used. I kept what I could after she died." Naomi knelt beside him, her fingers hovering over the fabric, afraid to touch something so precious. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you said you can sew. Because these materials deserve to be used, not just stored away like relics." Talon lifted out a bundle of buckskin and held it out to her. "If you want to work with your hands, if you want to make something, use these. My mother would have liked that better than having them rot in a trunk." Naomi took the buckskin with trembling hands. It was butter-soft and honey-colored, the kind of leather that took skill and patience to cure properly. The beadwork along one edge was exquisite, tiny blue and white beads arranged in geometric patterns that seemed to flow like water. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "What if I ruin it?" "Then you'll learn from the mistake and do better next time." Talon closed the trunk and stood. "But I don't think you will. I think you'll make something beautiful." That night, after supper was cleared and the lamps were lit, Naomi spread the buckskin across the table and studied it. She hadn't done serious sewing in months. Her father had forbidden her from taking commissions, said it made them look desperate, and her fingers felt clumsy as she threaded a needle with sinew from Talon's supplies. But muscle memory was a powerful thing, and within minutes she found her rhythm again. She started small, just a simple bag for storing dried herbs. Nothing fancy, nothing that would waste the precious material if she failed. But as the needle moved through the leather, pulling the edges together in tiny, precise stitches, Naomi felt something shifting inside her. This was hers. This work, this creation, this small act of making something from nothing, it belonged to her in a way nothing ever had before. Talon sat across from her, working on a bridle that needed new leather, and they settled into a comfortable silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the whisper of thread through hide. It felt domestic in a way Naomi had never experienced, partnership rather than servitude, companionship rather than obligation. "Can I ask you something?" Naomi said after a while. "Go ahead." "Why did you really pay my father's debt? And don't tell me it's because no one should be bought. I believe that, but there had to be more to it. You could have just left Dry Hollow and never looked back." Talon's hand stilled on the bridle. He was quiet for so long Naomi thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "I was in Dry Hollow buying supplies when I heard the commotion in the square. Heard your father offering you up like you were livestock, and I saw your face." "What about my face?" "You looked the way I felt when I was 9 years old and my father tried to trade me away. Like you'd already given up. Like you'd accepted that this was all you deserved." Talon's jaw tightened. "And I thought, if I can stop that from happening, if I can give one person the chance I didn't get when I needed it most, then maybe all the ugliness I survived meant something." Naomi's vision blurred. "You gave me more than a chance. You gave me a future. You gave yourself a future when you chose to leave. I just opened the door. Talon returned to his work, his voice gruff. Now finish that bag before the fire burns down and we're both sewing in the dark. Naomi laughed, actually laughed, and the sound startled her. When was the last time she'd laughed? She couldn't remember. But here, in this rough cabin with this quiet, scarred man who asked nothing from her but honesty, laughter came easily. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Naomi woke with the sun, helped with the morning chores, then spent the afternoon sewing while Talon worked with the horses. She finished the herb bag and started on other projects, mending Talon's worn shirts, taking in a pair of trousers that had seen better days, eventually attempting a leather vest using her mother's old patterns as a guide. Her hands grew stronger. So did her back, her legs, her arms. The constant physical labor was transforming her body in ways she hadn't expected. Not smaller, not lighter, but harder, more solid, more capable. She could lift a bucket of water without her arms shaking, could muck out a stall without needing to rest every few minutes, could split kindling for the fire with strokes that were growing steadier and more confident. And with the physical strength came something else, a growing sense that maybe, just maybe, her father had been wrong about her. That the voice in her head telling her she was worthless was a liar. That she could be strong and useful and valuable without shrinking herself down to nothing. One afternoon, 3 weeks after their arrival, Naomi was working on a new project, a shirt for Talon made from soft cotton she'd found in his supplies, when she heard horses approaching. She looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch, and saw Talon already moving toward the rifle that hung above the door. "Stay inside," he said quietly. Naomi's heart kicked into a faster rhythm, but she nodded and moved away from the window. Through the gap in the curtains, she could see 3 riders coming down the valley trail. Men on tired horses, their clothes dust-covered, and their faces hard. Talon stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loosely in his hands, but ready to raise if needed. Naomi couldn't hear what was said, but she watched the exchange with growing dread. One of the men gestured toward the cabin. Talon shook his head. The man insisted, his voice rising. Talon's stance didn't change, but something in his stillness became more dangerous. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the men turned their horses and rode back the way they'd come. Talon stayed on the porch until they were out of sight, then came back inside and hung the rifle back on its pegs. "Who were they?" Naomi asked, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "Men from Dry Hollow, looking for you." The bottom dropped out of Naomi's stomach. "What did they want?" "Your father sent them. Says you ran off with property that belonged to him. Says I stole you." Talon's expression was grim. "I told them you came of your own will and you're staying of your own will. Told them if they came back, they'd get a different kind of welcome." "Will they come back?" "Maybe. Depends on how desperate your father is." Talon crossed to the table and sat down heavily. "Naomi, I need you to understand something. If they come back with the lawman, if they try to take you by force, you need to be ready to speak up, to say clearly and publicly that you left by choice and you want to stay here. Can you do that?" Naomi's hands were shaking. The thought of facing her father again, of standing up in front of men who'd already decided she was property rather than person, made her want to curl up and disappear. But she thought about the past 3 weeks, about the strength she'd built and the voice she'd found, and she forced herself to nod. "I can do it." "You're sure?" "No," Naomi admitted, "but I'll do it anyway." Talon's expression softened. That's all courage is, being scared and doing it anyway. That night, Naomi couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, her mind churning through every possible scenario. What if they came back with the law? What if the law sided with her father? What if she opened her mouth to speak and no words came out, the way they always had before when confronted with male authority? She was still awake when she heard Talon moving in the main room. A moment later, there was a soft knock on her door. "You awake?" he called quietly. "Yes." "Can I come in?" Naomi sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "Yes?" Talon opened the door and stepped inside, a lamp in one hand casting flickering shadows on the walls. He sat on the edge of her bed, careful to keep a respectful distance, and set the lamp on the floor between them. You're afraid, he said. It wasn't a question. Terrified, Naomi whispered. Good. Fear means you understand what you're up against. Talon leaned back against the wall, his long legs stretched out in front of him. But fear doesn't have to win. You know what does? What? Anger. The good kind. The kind that says, I've survived this long and I'll be damned if I let anyone drag me back. His eyes glinted in the lamplight. You got any of that in you? Naomi thought about it. Thought about the years of hunger and shame. Thought about the rope and the laughter in her father's trembling hands. Thought about everything she'd lost and everything she'd found since leaving. Yes, she said, and felt the truth of it burning in her chest. I do. Then hold on to it. When they come, if they come, you reach for that anger and you let it make you strong. Talon stood, picking up the lamp. And remember, you're not alone in this. I'll be standing right beside you. Why? Naomi asked again, because she still couldn't quite believe in kindness without conditions. Because everyone deserves someone in their corner, Talon said simply, and because I like who you're becoming. Be ashamed to let your father steal that. He left, pulling the door closed behind him, and Naomi lay back down in the darkness. But this time, instead of fear, she felt something fiercer rising up inside her. Talon was right. She'd come too far to be dragged back now. She'd tasted freedom, tasted the possibility of a life built on her own terms, and she'd fight to keep it, even if it meant facing down the demons that had haunted her for 23 years, even if it meant standing alone in a storm of judgment and condemnation, even if it meant discovering just how strong she really was. They came 6 days later at dawn when the light was still gray and uncertain. Naomi was drawing water from the well when she heard the horses. More than 3 this time, maybe 5 or 6. Her hands froze on the rope, the bucket suspended halfway up the shaft, and for one breathless moment she considered running, just dropping everything and disappearing into the trees before anyone saw her. But then Talon's voice came from behind her, steady and calm. Pull up the water and go inside. Don't hide. Don't run. Just go inside and wait. Naomi's hands moved before her mind caught up, hauling the bucket the rest of the way and setting it on the stone rim of the well. She turned and saw Talon standing on the porch, the rifle once again in his hands, his face carved from something harder than stone. Their eyes met for just a second, and in that second she saw everything he'd been telling her for weeks. You're strong enough. You can do this. I'm with you. She walked to the cabin on legs that wanted to shake and didn't let them. Closed the door behind her and stood just inside, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Through the window, she watched the riders approach. 6 men, just as she'd guessed, with her father in the lead looking smaller and meaner than she remembered. Beside him rode Martin Cresswell from the land office, Buck Thornton, and 3 others she recognized from Dry Hollow. And behind them, sitting tall on a roan mare, was a man wearing a tarnished silver star on his vest. A marshal. They'd brought the law. Naomi's breath came short and fast. This was real. This was happening. In a few minutes, she'd have to walk out there and face them all, and everything she'd built over the past month would hang on whether she could find her voice when it mattered most. The riders pulled up 20 feet from the porch, their horses blowing and stamping. Talon didn't move, didn't lower the rifle, just watched them with the same patient stillness he used when gentling a spooked horse. Gray. The marshal spoke first, his voice carrying across the yard with an authority born of years wearing the badge. He was older than the others, maybe 50, with iron-gray hair and a face weathered by sun and hard living. I'm Marshal Dalton Hayes out of Cheyenne. I'm here on a complaint filed by Samuel Vale regarding the unlawful taking of his daughter. That'd be you we're talking about, I expect. Expect it would be, Talon said evenly. Except there wasn't anything unlawful about it. That's not how Mr. Vale tells it. Hayes shifted in his saddle, his hand resting casually on his thigh, nowhere near his gun, but making it clear he knew where it was. Says you paid his debt under false pretenses and then absconded with his daughter against her will. Says she's his dependent and he's got a legal right to her return. Samuel Vale's voice cracked like a whip before Talon could respond. She's my daughter, my blood. You got no right keeping her here like some Mr. Vale. Hayes's voice cut through Samuel's bluster with the efficiency of a knife. I'll handle this. You'll speak when I ask you to speak and not before. Samuel's mouth snapped shut, but the rage on his face didn't dim. Naomi could see it from where she stood. The red patches on his cheeks, the way his hands gripped his saddle horn like he was strangling it. He looked older than he had 6 weeks ago, thinner and more desperate, and there was a wildness in his eyes that made her stomach clench. The way I see it, Hayes continued, turning back to Talon, there's a simple solution here. I talk to the girl, she tells me what she wants, and we act accordingly. She says she wants to go home, you let her go. She says she wants to stay, Mr. Vale accepts that, and we all ride back to Dry Hollow with this matter settled. Sound fair? More than fair, Talon said. Naomi. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Naomi felt it like a hand at her back, pushing her forward when everything in her wanted to retreat. She forced her feet to move, forced herself to open the door and step out onto the porch. The morning air was cool on her face, and she could smell the horses and the dust they'd kicked up, and her own fear, sharp and metallic. 6 pairs of eyes swung toward her, 7, counting the marshals. Oh. Naomi felt their weight like physical things, pressing down on her shoulders, trying to force her back into the shape they'd always insisted she take. Small, quiet, obedient, worthless. But she wasn't that girl anymore. The past 6 weeks had burned that girl away and left someone harder in her place. Someone who could muck stalls and split wood and sew leather. Someone who'd ridden 4 days through punishing heat and survived. Someone who'd started to believe she might actually deserve the space she took up in the world. Naomi took her place beside Talon, her shoulder nearly brushing his, and looked at the men arrayed before her. Not down at the ground like she'd been taught. Not at some middle distance where she could pretend they weren't really there, but directly at them, meeting their eyes one by one until they were the ones who looked away. All except her father. Samuel stared at her with an intensity that would have shattered her a month ago, but now just made her angry. Miss Vale, Marshal Hayes said, his tone gentling slightly, I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer them honestly. Can you do that? Yes, sir. Naomi's voice came out stronger than she'd expected. Did you leave Dry Hollow of your own free will? I did. Did Mr. Gray here force you in any way, threaten you, or coerce you into leaving? No, sir. He offered me a choice. I took it. Samuel made a strangled sound. She doesn't know what she's saying. She's confused. She's been manipulated by this. Mr. Vale. Hayes didn't even look at him, his attention fixed on Naomi. Miss Vale, do you wish to return to your father's home in Dry Hollow? This was it. The question that would decide everything. Naomi could feel Talon beside her, solid and steady, but he didn't speak, didn't try to answer for her. This was hers to claim or reject, and no one else could do it for her. She thought about the cabin behind her, about the small room that was hers and hers alone, about the buckskin in her hands and the strength in her back, about the mornings when she woke up and didn't immediately brace herself for criticism or contempt, about Talon's patient teaching and quiet respect, about the person she was becoming when no one was telling her she was wrong just for existing. No, sir, Naomi said clearly. I don't wish to return. I'm staying here. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses seemed to sense the weight of the moment and went still. Then Samuel erupted. You ungrateful! After everything I did for you, I fed you, clothed you, kept a roof over your head for 23 years, and this is how you repay me? Running off with the first man who... You fed me scraps and told me I didn't deserve those. The words exploded out of Naomi before she could stop them, loud and raw and true. You made me weigh every bite, made me feel like taking up space was a sin I had to atone for every single day. You didn't keep me out of love, you kept me because you needed someone to blame for your failures. Samuel's face went purple. How dare you speak to me like, I dare because I'm not your property. Naomi's voice rose, shaking but fierce. I never was. You tried to sell me to pay your debts like I was a mule or a piece of furniture, and the only reason I'm not standing in Buck Thornton's kitchen right now scrubbing his floors is because this man, she gestured to Talon, this man saw me as a human being instead of a transaction. You're hysterical, Samuel spat. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. Naomi stepped forward, and she felt Talon shift slightly beside her, ready to intervene if needed, but letting her fight her own battle. I'm saying I'm done. I'm done shrinking myself to fit your idea of what I should be. I'm done apologizing for existing. I'm done letting you make me feel worthless." Her voice broke, but she pushed through it. "I'm your daughter, not your servant, and I don't owe you anything anymore." Marshal Hayes held up a hand before Samuel could respond. "I think I've heard enough." He turned to Samuel, and his expression had gone cold. "Mr. Vale, your daughter is of legal age and sound mind. She's stated clearly and repeatedly that she left of her own will and wishes to remain here. I got no grounds to force her to return with you, and frankly, after what I just heard, I wouldn't if I could." "But she's my—" Samuel was sputtering now, his face twisted with impotent rage. "She's an adult woman who's made her choice." Hayes's voice was flat and final. "You don't have to like it, but you do have to accept it. Now you can ride back to Dry Hollow peacefully, or I can escort you back in irons for disturbing the peace. Which is it going to be?" Martin Cresswell leaned over and said something low to Samuel, his hand on the older man's arm. Samuel shook him off violently, but some of the fight seemed to drain out of him. He looked at Naomi one more time, and the expression on his face was so full of hatred and loss and bitter disappointment that she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "You'll regret this," Samuel said, his voice hoarse. "When he tires of you, when you're alone and starving, you'll come crawling back and I won't be there. You hear me? I won't be there." "I know," Naomi said quietly. "And I'll still be better off than I ever was with you." The words hit him like a slap. For a moment, Samuel just stared at her, his mouth working soundlessly, and then he wheeled his horse around so violently the animal nearly reared. He kicked it into a gallop, riding back up the valley trail without another word. Martin Cresswell and Buck Thornton exchanged glances, tipped their hats to the marshal, and followed at a more sedate pace. The other 3 men from Dry Hollow trailed after them, leaving only Marshal Hayes sitting his roan mare in the morning light. Hayes studied Naomi for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he nodded, a sharp dip of his chin. "You've got steel in you, Miss Vale. Don't see that every day." He glanced at Talon. "Gray, you treat her right, you hear me? I catch wind of anything improper going on out here, I'll be back and I won't be asking polite questions." "Understood," Talon said, "but there won't be anything improper. Naomi's a free woman working for fair wages, nothing more, nothing less. See that it stays that way." Hayes touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Vale, you ever need help, you send word to Cheyenne. I'll make sure you get a fair hearing." "Thank you, Marshal," Naomi managed. Hayes turned his horse and rode after the others, and within minutes the valley was empty again except for Naomi and Talon standing on the porch. The silence rushed in like water filling a void, and Naomi felt her knees start to give way. Talon caught her elbow, steadying her, and guided her to sit on the porch steps. "You did it," he said quietly. Naomi looked down at her hands. They were shaking so badly she had to clench them into fists to make it stop. "I thought I was going to faint." "But you didn't. You stood there and you told the truth, and that's the bravest thing I've ever seen." "It didn't feel brave. It felt terrifying." "That's what makes it brave." Helen sat beside her, his shoulder warm against hers. "Courage isn't not being afraid. It's being afraid and doing what needs doing anyway. You just faced down your father and a marshal and 6 witnesses and told them all you weren't going back. That's not nothing, Naomi." She let out a shaky laugh that was half sob. "He hates me now. You saw his face. He really hates me." "He hated you before," Talon said bluntly. "He just hid it better, or you were better at not seeing it." The truth of that settled into Naomi's bones like cold. Her father had never loved her, not really. He'd tolerated her when she was useful and resented her when she wasn't. And the closest thing to affection he'd ever shown was leaving her alone. She'd spent 23 years trying to earn something he'd never had to give in the first place. "I keep waiting to feel relieved," Naomi said after a while. "Like I should be celebrating or something, but I just feel empty." "Give it time. You just cut away a piece of yourself that's been rotting for years. Takes a while for the wound to start healing." Talon stood and offered her his hand. "Come on. Work helps. Let's go check the fences in the north pasture." Naomi let him pull her to her feet, and they spent the rest of the morning walking the fence line, replacing rotted posts and tightening wire. The physical labor was exactly what she needed. Something simple and clear, something that required her hands and back but gave her mind space to settle. By the time they returned to the cabin for lunch, the shaking had stopped, and she could breathe without feeling like her chest was caught in a vice. Over the next few days, Naomi waited for the other shoe to drop, for her father to come back with more men or a better lawyer, for the marshal to change his mind, for something to go wrong and drag her back into the life she'd escaped. But nothing came. The valley stayed quiet except for the wind and the creek and the horses moving through the grass, and slowly, carefully, Naomi started to believe that maybe it was really over, that she'd actually won. A week after the confrontation, she was in the barn mending a torn saddle blanket when she heard a horse approaching. Her heart kicked into a faster rhythm. She'd probably never hear hoofbeats without a spike of fear again. But when she looked up, she saw a woman riding into the yard. Young, maybe Naomi's age or a little younger, with dark hair escaping from a braid and a face that might have been pretty if it wasn't so bruised. Talon came out of the cabin, moving with that same watchful caution he'd shown when the men from Dry Hollow arrived. But his posture changed when he saw the rider was alone and female, relaxing fractionally. "Help you?" he called. The woman pulled her horse to a stop and sat there for a moment, swaying slightly in the saddle. Up close, Naomi could see the bruises were fresh, purpling around her left eye, yellowing along her jaw. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, hastily pinned back together, and there was a desperation in her eyes that Naomi recognized bone deep. "I heard," the woman said, her voice thin and cracking. "I heard there was a woman here. A woman who stood up to her father and the marshal and said she wasn't going back." Naomi set down the saddle blanket and walked slowly out of the barn. "You heard right." The woman's eyes found hers, and something in her face crumpled. "I need help, please. I can't go back to him. I can't." "Who?" Talon asked gently. "My husband." The word came out like a curse. "Jacob Crane. He's a rancher up near the border, and he's... Her voice broke entirely, and she started to cry, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. Naomi moved without thinking, reaching up to help the woman down from her horse. The woman collapsed against her, all dead weight and grief, and Naomi held her up through sheer stubborn strength. Talon took the horse's reins and led it toward the barn, while Naomi guided the woman, girl, really, she couldn't be more than 20, into the cabin and sat her down at the table. "What's your name?" Naomi asked, pouring water from the pitcher. "Clara." The girl took the cup with shaking hands and drank like she hadn't had water in days. "Clara Crane, though I'd give anything to not be a Crane anymore." "What happened to you, Clara?" Clara touched her bruised face, then dropped her hand like it hurt too much to make contact. "I ran. He was drunk and angry about something. He's always angry about something. And he hit me harder than usual, knocked me clean across the room, and I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't take one more beating and pretend everything was fine. So I waited until he passed out, took his gentlest horse, and rode." "Does he know where you are?" Talon asked from the doorway. "I don't think so. I heard about you in Spring Creek when I stopped to water the horse. Woman at the general store told me about Naomi Vale standing up to her father, said if I needed a place to go, I might try here." Clara looked between them, her eyes desperate. "I don't have money. I don't have anything except what I'm wearing. But I can work. I'm strong. I can cook and clean and mend. I just need somewhere he won't find me." Naomi looked at Talon, a question in her eyes. This was his home, his ranch, his decision. But Talon was looking back at her with an expression that said the choice was hers as much as his. "You can stay," Naomi said, "as long as you need." Clara's face crumpled again, but this time the tears were relief instead of despair. Thank you so much." They set Clara up in the main room for the moment, giving her blankets and pillows to make a pallet by the fire. She fell asleep almost immediately, exhaustion and stress pulling her under, and Naomi and Talon stepped outside to talk. "We can't turn her away," Naomi said before Talon could speak. "I know it complicates things. I know it's a risk, but—" "I wasn't going to suggest we turn her away," Talon interrupted gently. "I was going to say we need to be ready for her husband to come looking. Men like that don't let their property walk off without a fight." Property. The word made Naomi's stomach turn. She's not property. I know that, you know that, but Jacob Crane probably thinks different. Talon leaned against the porch railing, his gaze on the horizon. We helped one woman stand up for herself, and word spread. Now we've got two. If we're not careful, we're going to end up with a reputation. Would that be so bad? Talon turned to look at her, surprise flickering across his face. You want to turn this place into a refuge for runaway wives? I want to help people who need help, Naomi said fiercely. The way you helped me? Is that so wrong? Not wrong. Dangerous. But there was something in Talon's eyes that looked almost like pride. You understand what you're proposing? We'd be making enemies of every man who thinks he owns his wife or daughter. We'd be painting a target on our backs. Then we'd better learn to shoot straight. Talon laughed, a short surprise sound. All right then. We help her, and anyone else who shows up needing it. But we do it smart. We teach them to defend themselves, to work, to stand on their own feet. We don't just hide them, we make them strong enough they don't need hiding. Agreed, Naomi said, and felt something settling into place in her chest. A purpose. A direction. Something bigger than just survival. That evening, when Clara woke, they sat her down and laid out the terms. She could stay as long as she needed, but she'd work for her keep, helping with the ranch, learning skills that would serve her whether she stayed or moved on. She'd learn to shoot, to ride properly, to defend herself if her husband came calling. And in return, they'd give her shelter and safety and the space to heal. Clara agreed to everything, her eyes shining with something that looked like hope. Over the next 2 weeks, the cabin became crowded in the best possible way. Clara proved to be an excellent cook and a hard worker, and she and Naomi fell into an easy partnership that felt like the beginning of friendship. Talon taught them both to shoot, setting up targets in the back pasture and drilling them on stance and aim until their shoulders ached from the rifle's kick. Clara was a natural, her hand steady and her eye good. Naomi was less skilled but grimly determined, and by the end of the second week she could hit a target at 50 yards more often than not. They were practicing one afternoon when they heard horses again. 3 this time, riding hard. Naomi's heart sank when she saw the lead rider, a big man on a bigger horse, his face twisted with rage even from a distance. That's Jacob, Clara whispered, her face going white. That's my husband. Inside, Talon said sharply. Both of you, now. No, Clara's voice was shaking but firm. No, I'm done hiding. If he wants me, he's going to have to face me first. Naomi grabbed her hand and squeezed. Then we face him together. The 3 of them stood on the porch as Jacob Crane and his 2 hired men pulled up in a cloud of dust. Crane was everything Naomi had expected, thick-shouldered and mean-eyed with hands that looked like they were used to breaking things. He swung down from his horse with a violence that made the animal shy away. Clara! His voice was a roar. Get over here, now! Clara flinched but didn't move. Naomi felt her trembling and held on tighter. She's not going anywhere, Talon said, his rifle pointed at the ground but ready to rise. The hell she's not. That's my wife, and she's coming home with me if I have to drag her by her hair. Crane took a step forward, and Talon raised the rifle in one smooth motion. Take another step and find out what happens. Crane stopped, but the rage on his face didn't diminish. You can't keep her. I got legal rights. She's mine. I'm not yours. Clara's voice was small but growing stronger. I was never yours. You bought me from my father like a broodmare, and I was too young and stupid to know I could say no, but I'm saying it now. No, I'm not coming back. You don't have a choice. Yes, she does. Naomi stepped forward, putting herself between Clara and her husband. She has every choice, and she's choosing to stay here where men don't use their fists to make a point. Crane's eyes raked over Naomi with unconcealed contempt. You're that Vale girl. Heard about you. Heard you ran off and shacked up with a half-breed. Guess broken women find broken men. The words were meant to wound, but they just made Naomi angry. Better broken and free than whole and owned. Clara, Crane's voice cracked like a whip. I'm giving you one last chance. Get on this horse, or I'll make you regret ever being born. You already do that, Clara said quietly. Every day I was with you, you made me regret it. But I'm done regretting. I'm done being afraid. You want me back, you're going to have to kill me, because I'm not going willingly. Crane's hand dropped to his gun, and everything happened at once. Talon's rifle came up fully, the crack of the shot echoing across the valley as he fired into the dirt at Crane's feet. One of the hired men reached for his own weapon, and Naomi raised her rifle. When had she picked it up? Her hands surprisingly steady. Clara stood frozen beside her, her breath coming in short gasps. "Next shot goes through your skull," Talon said calmly. "You and your boys ride out now, or I put you in the ground. Your choice." Crane stood there, his hand still hovering over his gun, his face purple with impotent rage. The hired men were looking at each other, clearly reconsidering their employment. Finally, one of them spoke up. "Boss, this ain't worth dying over. Let's go." "Shut up," Crane snarled, but some of the certainty had drained from his voice. "Your man's got sense," Talon said. "More than you, anyway. Now get on your horse and ride before I lose my patience." For a long, terrible moment, Naomi thought Crane was going to draw anyway. Thought she was going to watch Talon kill a man. Or worse, watch Crane kill Talon. But then Crane spat in the dirt, a glob of brown tobacco that landed inches from the porch steps. "Keep her," he snarled. "Worthless cow wasn't worth the trouble anyway, but you better watch your back, Gray. You and your whores both." He swung back into his saddle and wheeled his horse around, galloping back up the trail with his men following. They watched until the riders were out of sight, and only then did Naomi lower her rifle. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Clara sat down hard on the porch steps and started laughing, high and slightly hysterical, but genuine. "I did it," she gasped between laughs. "I actually told him no." "You did," Naomi said, sinking down beside her. "We both did." Talon lowered his rifle and let out a long breath. "That's two." "Two what?" Clara asked. "Two women who stood up and said they weren't going back." Talon looked at them both, and something like wonder crossed his face. "I got a feeling it's not going to stop at two." He was right. Over the next month, 3 more women found their way to the valley. Sarah, whose father had tried to marry her off to a man 40 years her senior. Beth, who'd been working as a saloon girl in Spring Creek and couldn't take the grabbing hands anymore. And Marie, barely 16, who'd run from a household where her stepfather's attention had turned predatory. The cabin couldn't hold them all, so they started building. Simple structures at first, just lean-tos and dugouts that would provide shelter until something better could be arranged. Talon taught them all to work with wood and stone, and Naomi found herself organizing, planning, turning the scattered refugees into something that resembled a community. She also started sewing in earnest. The women needed practical clothes, durable trousers and shirts that could stand up to hard labor, not the fragile dresses designed to keep women decorative and helpless. Naomi designed patterns based on men's work clothes but modified for women's bodies, and soon she had more commissions than she could handle. Women from Spring Creek and even farther started sending orders, willing to pay good money for clothes that let them move and breathe and work without restriction. The money came in slowly at first, then faster. Enough to buy more supplies, more fabric, more food for the growing household. Enough to start thinking about permanence instead of just survival. One evening, 2 months after Clara's arrival, Naomi sat on the porch and looked out over what they'd built. 6 women, all working together, all learning to be strong. A cluster of buildings that was starting to look less like a camp and more like a settlement. A community forged from desperation and defiance, and the simple radical belief that women deserve to choose their own lives. Talon came out and sat beside her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He passed her one and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the mountains. "You know this is going to get harder," he said eventually. "More women means more angry men looking for them, more danger, more fights like the ones we've already had." "I know," Naomi said. "You still want to do this?" She thought about the girl she'd been 2 months ago, standing in the dry hollow square with a rope over her head and death in her heart. Thought about the woman she was becoming, scarred and strong and absolutely certain that she'd rather die fighting than live on her knees. "Yes," she said simply. "I want to do this." Talon smiled, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Then I guess we'd better get ready, because I got a feeling we've only seen the beginning." He was right about that too, but neither of them could have predicted just how much bigger it was going to get. By winter, they numbered 12. 12 women who'd arrived with nothing but bruises and fear, and who were slowly transforming into something the territory had never quite seen before. A community of women who answered to no man's authority but their own. The settlement had grown beyond anything Naomi could have imagined that first night when Clara stumbled into their yard. What had started as desperate improvisation had become deliberate construction. They'd built 4 cabins now, sturdy structures with real floors and stone fireplaces, arranged in a loose semicircle around a central courtyard where they took their meals together when the weather allowed. There was a smokehouse, a root cellar dug deep into the hillside, and a workshop where Naomi had set up her sewing operation with 3 other women who'd proven skilled with needle and thread. The clothing business had exploded. Women across the territory were hungry for practical garments that didn't treat their bodies like decoration. And Naomi's designs, reinforced trousers with deep pockets, shirts that buttoned up the front instead of requiring a corset, split skirts that allowed for riding astride, sold as fast as they could make them. Orders came in from as far as Denver and Cheyenne, and the money they brought in was enough to buy supplies, pay for materials, and start putting aside savings for the future. Talon had expanded the horse operation to accommodate the extra hands, and several of the women had proven natural riders. Beth in particular had a gift for it, her small frame and quiet patience making her perfect for gentling the younger horses. Sarah ran the household accounts with a precision that would have shamed most bookkeepers, and Marie, despite her youth, had taken to metalwork like she was born for it, helping Talon repair tools and forge the iron fittings they needed for construction. It should have been perfect. It should have been enough. But Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that they were living on borrowed time, that the piece they'd carved out was too fragile to last. She was right. The first real snow of winter had fallen 3 days earlier, blanketing the valley in white and turning the world quiet and strange. Naomi was in the workshop cutting fabric for a new batch of orders when she heard the commotion outside. Raised voices, the sharp crack of something hitting wood, and underneath it all a sound that made her blood run cold, a child crying. She dropped her scissors and ran. In the courtyard, Clara and Beth were helping a woman down from a horse. The woman was young, maybe 30, with red hair plastered to her skull by melting snow and a face that was more bruised than skin. But it was the bundle in her arms that made Naomi's heart clench. A little girl, maybe 4 years old, sobbing into her mother's shoulder. "Inside," Naomi said, already moving toward them. "Get them both inside and warmed up. Beth, start water heating. Clara, get blankets." The woman stumbled and Naomi caught her, feeling ribs through the thin fabric of her dress. She was bone-thin, shaking with cold and exhaustion, and the child in her arms wasn't much better. Naomi guided them into the nearest cabin, where Sarah already had the fire built up high, and helped the woman sit in the chair closest to the hearth. "What's your name?" Naomi asked gently, kneeling so she was eye level with the woman. "Rose." The woman's teeth were chattering so hard she could barely speak. "Rose Garrett. This is my daughter, Lily." The little girl had stopped crying but was pressed so tightly against her mother it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Her eyes were huge and dark, fixed on Naomi with the kind of wary terror that came from seeing too much violence too young. Clara appeared with blankets, and Naomi wrapped them around Rose and Lily both, tucking the wool tight against the cold. Beth brought hot coffee laced with honey, and Rose drank it with shaking hands while Lily watched everything with those 2 old eyes. "How long have you been traveling?" Naomi asked. 3 days, maybe 4. I lost track." Rose's voice was raw. "I heard about this place from a woman in Laramie. She said there was a settlement in the southern valley where women could go if they needed help. Said there was a woman named Naomi who'd stood up to her father and won." The story had spread farther than Naomi had realized. It should have made her proud, but instead it just made her more afraid. Every woman who came brought her own set of pursuers, her own angry men who thought they had a right to drag her back. "Who are you running from?" Talon's voice came from the doorway. He stood there with snow dusting his shoulders, his expression carefully neutral, but Naomi could see the tension in the set of his jaw. "My husband, Thomas Garrett. He's a foreman at the lumber mill outside Laramie." Rose's hands tightened around the coffee cup. "He's always been hard, but after Lily was born, he got worse, meaner, started taking his anger out on both of us. Last week her voice broke, he hit Lily. knocked her clear across the room because she spilled his dinner. And I knew if I didn't leave then, if I waited even one more day, he was going to kill one of us. Lily whimpered at her mother's words, and Rose pulled her closer, pressing her face into the child's hair. You did the right thing, Naomi said firmly. Both of you are safe here. But will we stay safe? Rose looked up, and the fear in her eyes was stark. Thomas won't let this go. He'll come looking, and he won't come alone. He's got friends, men from the mill who think the way he does. Men who believe a woman's got no right to leave. Let him come, Sarah said from across the room. She was cleaning her rifle, the same one Talon had taught her to shoot 3 weeks ago. We faced down angry husbands before. Not one's bringing a crew of loggers, Talon said quietly. That's different. That's an organized threat, not just one man and his pride. The room fell silent except for the crackle of the fire. Naomi looked around at the faces of the women gathered there, Clara, Beth, Sarah, Marie, and the others who drifted in when they heard the commotion. They were stronger than they'd been when they arrived, harder and more capable, but they were still just women with basic firearms training and a handful of rifles between them. So what do we do? Clara asked. Naomi stood, her mind already working through possibilities. We prepare. We make this place defensible, and we get ready to fight if we have to. But more than that, we make ourselves visible. We stop hiding like we're the ones who did something wrong. What do you mean? Beth asked. I mean, we go into Spring Creek, all of us, and we tell our stories. We let people know what we're building here and why. We find allies. There have to be people who'll support what we're doing. And we make it clear that if anyone comes for us, they're not just fighting a handful of scared women. They're fighting a community. That's a risk, Talon said. Going public means painting an even bigger target on our backs. We're already a target, Naomi shot back. Hiding hasn't protected us. Maybe being seen will. Sarah set down her rifle. I'm with Naomi. I'm tired of acting like we're criminals for wanting to live without getting beaten. Me too, Clara said, and around the room, one by one, the other women nodded their agreement. Talon looked at Naomi for a long moment, and she could see him weighing risks and possibilities, calculating odds the way he always did. Finally, he nodded. All right, we do it your way, but we do it smart, and we go in armed. They rode into Spring Creek a week later, all 12 women plus Talon, a procession that turned heads from the moment they entered the main street. Naomi rode at the front on one of Talon's steadiest mares, her new split skirt practical and bold, her hair pulled back severe and uncompromising. The other women flanked her, and though some of them were nervous, Marie kept fidgeting with her reins, and Rose held Lily so tight the child squirmed. They all sat their horses with a determination that was impossible to miss. Spring Creek was bigger than Dry Hollow, prosperous enough to have a real hotel, 2 saloons, a mercantile, and a newspaper office. People stopped what they were doing to stare as the women rode past, and Naomi could hear the whispers starting, spreading like ripples in water. They stopped in front of the newspaper office, and Naomi dismounted, handing her reins to Beth. The door opened before she could knock, and a man stepped out, middle-aged, ink-stained, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a skeptical expression. Help you? He asked. I want to place an advertisement, Naomi said, and I want to tell you a story. The newspaper man, his name was Theodore Finch, and he turned out to be far more sympathetic than his expression suggested, listened to everything. He listened to Naomi describe the settlement they were building, the women they were helping, the clothing business that was proving a woman could earn her own way without a husband to manage her. He listened to Clara talk about the beatings she'd endured, to Sarah describe being sold by her father like livestock, to Rose explain why she'd fled with her daughter in the middle of winter rather than stay one more day with a man who saw violence as his right. When they were done, Finch sat back in his chair and pulled off his spectacles, cleaning them with a handkerchief. This is going to make some people very angry. I know, Naomi said. I mean very angry, the kind of angry that comes with torches and guns. I know that too. But will you print it? Finch studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yes, I'll print it, because it's news and because it's true and because my wife would never forgive me if I didn't. He picked up his pen. But I'm also going to write an editorial alongside it, and I'm going to make it very clear that any man who rides out to your settlement looking for violence will have to answer to the law and to decent society." "Will that help?" Clara asked. "Maybe, maybe not, but it's better than silence." Finch started writing, his pen scratching across the paper. "You're building something important here, ladies. Don't let the bastards tear it down." The article ran 3 days later, and the response was immediate and divided. Some people were outraged, calling the settlement a den of iniquity where women abandoned their sacred duties. Others were quietly supportive, sending supplies and money with notes that said simply, "Keep going." And some, like Thomas Garrett, prepared for war. He came 2 weeks after the article, just as Rose had predicted. But he didn't come alone. 15 men rode into the valley just after dawn, loggers and mill workers, ranch hands and drifters, all united by the conviction that women needed to be put back in their place. They came armed and angry, and they came expecting an easy victory. What they found instead was a settlement prepared to defend itself. Naomi had spent the 2 weeks since the article preparing for exactly this. They'd built barricades, positioned firing positions, and drilled relentlessly until every woman could load and fire without thinking. They'd sent Lily and one of the older women to hide in a cave up in the hills, where they'd be safe no matter what happened. And they'd made a pact. They would not surrender, they would not run, and they would not apologize for choosing freedom over submission. When the riders appeared at the valley's entrance, Naomi was ready. She stood behind a barricade with her rifle braced against her shoulder, Clara on her left and Talon on her right, and she watched Thomas Garrett ride forward with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no. "Rose!" His voice echoed across the valley. "Get out here! You and the girl are coming home!" Rose stepped up beside Naomi, her own rifle steady in her hands. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Thomas." "Oh, the hell you're not. You're my wife, and Lily's my daughter, and you don't get to just leave." "I left 2 weeks ago," Rose called back. "And I'll die before I let you touch my daughter again." Garrett's face went purple with rage. "You've got no right." "I've got every right," Rose's voice rose, strong and clear. "You beat me for 6 years. You terrorized our child." "You think a marriage license makes that acceptable? You think I'm supposed to suffer that because some preacher said words over us? You took vows. So did you. You promised to cherish me, to honor me, and you broke those vows every time you raised your fist." Rose's hands shook, but her voice didn't. "I'm done, Thomas. I'm not your property, and Lily isn't either. Go home and leave us alone." Garrett turned to the men behind him. "You hear this? You hear how these women talk to their husbands? This is what happens when you let them get ideas, when you let them think they're equal." He looked back at the settlement. "We're taking our women back, and we're teaching the rest of them what happens when you forget your place." "Try it," Talon said, his voice carrying cold and clear, "and see what happens." For a moment, everything hung in balance. Garrett and his men on one side, the settlement on the other, and between them the terrible space where decisions turned to action and talk became violence. Then Marshal Hayes rode into the valley from the South Trail, his badge catching the morning light. "That's far enough, Garrett," Hayes called out. "You and your boys turn around and ride out, or I'll arrest every last one of you for disturbing the peace and making terroristic threats." Garrett wheeled his horse to face the marshal. "You can't be serious. These women are stolen property. They're free citizens who've made their choices clear," Hayes interrupted. "And I've got a court order here that says any man who tries to force them back against their will is violating territorial law." He patted his saddlebag. "Got it signed by Judge Morrison himself after he read about your settlement in the newspaper. Judge was real interested in the part where you beat your daughter, Garrett. Real interested." The color drained from Garrett's face. "That's a lie. Rose is lying. So's the doctor in Laramie who documented Lily's injuries. So's the school teacher who saw the bruises. So's the neighbor who heard the screaming." Hayes's voice was flat and merciless. "Judge wants to see you in Cheyenne, Garrett. Wants to ask you some questions about child cruelty and assault. You can ride there voluntarily, or I can take you in chains. Your choice." The men behind Garrett were murmuring now, backing their horses up, clearly rethinking their participation. Whatever they'd been promised or told, nobody wanted to face down a federal marshal and a court order. Garrett sat frozen on his horse, his face a mask of impotent fury. Then, without another word, he yanked his horse around and galloped back up the trail. His men followed in a disorganized stream, and within minutes the valley was empty again except for Hayes, still sitting his horse at the entrance. The marshal rode forward slowly, stopping a respectful distance from the barricades. "Miss Vale, ladies, Mr. Gray." "Marshal," Naomi said, lowering her rifle but not putting it away. "Thank you for the timing." "Thank Mr. Finch at the newspaper. He's the one who brought this to the judge's attention." Hayes leaned forward in his saddle. "I'll be honest with you. What you're building here makes a lot of people nervous. Women living independently, taking in runaways, refusing to be governed by traditional authority. That scares men who like the world the way it is." "Are you one of those men?" Talon asked. Hayes was quiet for a moment. "My wife left me 3 years ago, took our daughters and went to live with her sister in St. Louis. I was angry about it for a long time, felt like she'd betrayed me." He looked at Rose. "Then I started seeing women like you with faces like you had when you arrived here. Started hearing stories like the ones in Finch's article. And I realized my wife didn't betray me. She saved herself and our girls from becoming what she saw coming." He straightened in his saddle. "So no, I'm not one of those men. Not anymore." "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Now I take Garrett to Cheyenne and let the judge sort him out. Now I make sure word spreads that this settlement is under the law's protection, and anyone who comes here looking for trouble will answer to more than just you." Hayes gathered his reins. "But I'll be straight with you. I can't be everywhere, and the law can only do so much. You want this place to survive, you're going to need more than my protection. You're going to need to prove you belong here." "How do we do that?" Naomi asked. "Same way anyone does. You build. You work. You become part of the territory's fabric instead of just an oddity on its edges. You make yourselves indispensable." Hayes touched his hat brim. "I'll do what I can to help. But the real work is yours." He rode out, and the settlement slowly came back to life. Women emerged from firing positions, lowered weapons, let out breaths they'd been holding. Rose was crying, and Clara had her arms around her, whispering comfort. Sarah was already directing people to dismantle the barricades, her practical mind already moving to the next task. Talon found Naomi standing alone at the edge of the courtyard, staring out at the valley. "You all right?" "We almost had to kill people today," Naomi said quietly. "If Hayes hadn't shown up, we would have had to shoot them." "I know." "Could you have done it? Could you have actually pulled that trigger?" Talon was quiet for a long moment. "Yes. To protect this place, to protect you and the others. Yes, I could have. Question is, could you?" Naomi thought about it honestly, thought about what this settlement meant, about the women who'd found safety here, about the future they were building. Thought about Rose and Lily, about Clara's bruised face that first day, about every woman who'd arrived broken and was slowly becoming whole. "Yes," she said finally. "If it meant protecting them, I could." "Good." Talon's hand found hers, his calloused fingers threading through her own. "Because Hayes is right. This is just the beginning. There will be more threats, more fights, more men who think they can crush what we're building, and we need to be ready to defend it." "We will be," Naomi said, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. The winter passed, brutal and beautiful. Snow piled high in the valley, and the women learned to survive in conditions that would have broken them months earlier. They chopped wood and hauled water, hunted game and preserved meat, kept the fires burning and the cabins warm. And when spring finally came, melting the snow and turning the valley green again, they emerged harder and stronger than before. The clothing business flourished. Naomi hired 2 more seamstresses from Spring Creek, women who needed work and didn't care that their employer was running a refuge for runaways. The workshop expanded, and soon they were producing not just practical work clothes, but also fine garments for sale in Denver and beyond. The money poured in, and with it came the ability to purchase land legally, to expand their buildings, to hire help for the heavier construction. By summer, the settlement had become permanent. They had 10 cabins, a communal dining hall, a proper schoolhouse where Marie taught reading and arithmetic to Lily and the other children who'd arrived with their mothers. They had gardens and livestock, a well-stocked root cellar, and enough supplies to weather any storm. They had rifles and ammunition, horses and wagons, and most importantly, they had a reputation. Women seeking refuge no longer stumbled into the valley by accident or desperate rumor. They came deliberately, knowing exactly where they were going, and what they'd find. And when they arrived, they found not just shelter, but purpose. Not just safety, but dignity. Not just survival, but the radical possibility of thriving. Naomi stood in the courtyard one evening in late summer, watching the women gather for supper. Lily was playing with two other children near the well, her laughter bright and unafraid. Rose was helping Clara carry food from the kitchen, both of them chatting easily. Sarah was going over accounts with Beth, their heads bent together over a ledger. Marie was showing one of the newer arrivals how to work the forge, the ring of hammer on metal carrying across the valley like a bell. This was what freedom looked like. Not perfect, not easy, but earned and chosen and fiercely protected. Talon came to stand beside her, 2 plates of food in his hands. He passed her one, and they ate together in comfortable silence, watching the community they'd built together take shape in the golden evening light. "You know what I realized?" Naomi said after a while. "What's that?" "The day my father offered me up in Dry Hollow, I thought my life was ending. Thought I was being sold into another kind of slavery." She looked around the settlement at all the women who'd found their way here. But it was actually the beginning of all of this. "You built this," Talon said quietly. "You and your stubbornness and your refusal to stay small." "We built it," Naomi corrected. "You gave me the space to discover who I could be. All I did was grow into it." "That's more than most people ever manage." They finished their meal as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. And when the stars came out, bright and infinite overhead, Naomi felt something she'd never expected to feel again. Peace. Not the peace of submission or silence, but the peace that came from knowing exactly where you stood and being willing to fight for it. She'd come to the valley with nothing but fear and desperation. Now she had a home, a purpose, and a future she'd carved out with her own scarred hands. The journey from that rope in Dry Hollow to this evening in the settlement had been brutal, but it had also been necessary. Because some transformations only happened through fire, and some strengths only revealed themselves under pressure. Naomi Vale had been tested and had not broken. And now she stood tall in a valley of her own making, surrounded by women who'd survived their own fires, and together they were building something the frontier had never quite seen before. A place where strength meant more than size, where worth wasn't measured by beauty or obedience, where women could simply be without apology or shame. A place called freedom. 2 years changed everything. The settlement that had started as a desperate refuge for 6 women had grown into something the territorial legislature couldn't ignore. 23 women now called the valley home, along with 7 children and a handful of men who'd proven themselves trustworthy enough to work alongside them. The cluster of rough cabins had evolved into a proper town with streets laid out in neat lines, buildings that would stand for generations, and a reputation that reached far beyond Wyoming territory. They called it Vale's Haven, though Naomi had argued against using her name. She'd lost that argument spectacularly when the women voted unanimously to honor the person who'd given them all a second chance at living. The name stuck, and now it appeared on maps and in newspapers, in territorial records and supply orders, a permanent mark on a landscape that had tried so hard to erase them. The clothing business had become an empire in miniature. What started with Naomi's practical designs had expanded into a catalog operation that shipped across the Western territories and as far east as Chicago. Women everywhere wanted the freedom that came with trousers that fit properly, shirts that didn't require assistance to fasten, riding skirts that allowed them to work alongside men without apologizing for their bodies. The workshop employed 15 seamstresses now, and they could barely keep up with demand. But it wasn't just the business that had grown. The Haven had become a center for something larger. A movement, some called it, though Naomi hated the grandiosity of that word. Women came not just seeking refuge, but seeking purpose, education, skills that would make them self-sufficient. They'd started a school that taught reading, arithmetic, and bookkeeping alongside more traditional subjects. They'd built a lending library. They'd established a fund to help women escape dangerous situations and start new lives. And they'd become politically active in ways that made certain powerful men very, very nervous. Naomi was in the workshop going over designs for the fall catalog when Sarah burst through the door, her face flushed with excitement and something that looked like fear. "You need to see this," Sarah said, waving a newspaper. "Finch just rode out from Spring Creek to deliver it himself." Naomi took the paper and her blood ran cold as she read the headline. Territorial Legislature debates Haven question, proposed law would restrict women's independent living. The article detailed a bill being introduced that would require all unmarried women over the age of 18 to live under the guardianship of a father, brother, or other male relative. Any woman found living independently could be declared a vagrant and remanded to the custody of the nearest male authority figure. The law was clearly aimed at Vale's Haven, though it was couched in language about public morality and social order. "They're trying to make what we do illegal," Sarah said quietly. "If this passes, everything we've built won't matter," Naomi finished. "They'll disband us, scatter us, send everyone back to exactly what they were running from." Clara appeared in the doorway, followed by Beth and Marie. Word was spreading fast, and within minutes the workshop was crowded with women, all of them reading the article, all of them understanding exactly what it meant. "What do we do?" Rose asked, and Naomi could hear the edge of old fear creeping back into her voice. "We can't fight the territorial legislature. We don't have that kind of power." "Maybe we don't," Naomi said slowly, her mind already working through possibilities. "But we have something they need." "What's that?" Beth asked. "Money, jobs, respectability." Naomi set down the newspaper. "The Haven employs over 30 people directly and supports probably twice that many through our supply purchases and shipping contracts. We pay taxes. We contribute to the territorial economy. And most importantly, we've been completely legal and above board in everything we've done. Judge Morrison himself validated our land purchases." "So we fight this in court?" Marie asked. "We fight it everywhere," Naomi said. "In court, in the newspapers, in the legislature itself. We make it clear that shutting us down would be an economic disaster and a moral outrage. And we do it publicly, so everyone can see exactly what these men are trying to do." "That's risky," Clara said. "Going public means exposing ourselves even more." "We're already exposed," Naomi countered. "Hiding hasn't protected us. Maybe it's time to stop acting like we're doing something wrong and start demanding the world recognize what we're doing is right." Talon had been standing quietly in the corner, listening. Now he stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "You're talking about going to Cheyenne, testifying before the legislature." "I'm talking about making them look us in the eyes when they try to destroy us," Naomi said. "I'm talking about bringing every woman here who wants to speak and telling our stories where they can't be ignored or dismissed." "They'll tear you apart," Talon said quietly. "You know that, right? They'll question your morals, your sanity, your right to exist. It won't be gentle, and it won't be fair." "Nothing about our lives has been gentle or fair," Rose said, stepping up beside Naomi. "But we're still here, and I, for one, am willing to stand up and say why." Around the room, women were nodding. The fear was still there. Naomi could see it in their faces, but beneath it was something stronger, a determination born from having already survived the worst and come out the other side. "Then we go to Cheyenne," Naomi said, "all of us who can make the trip, and we show them exactly what they're trying to legislate out of existence." They left for Cheyenne a week later, a delegation of 12 women and Talon traveling in 3 wagons loaded with samples of their work and copies of their financial records. The journey took 4 days, and they used the time to prepare their testimony, practicing arguments and anticipating attacks. Naomi had written to Judge Morrison, who'd agreed to speak on their behalf, and Theodore Finch had rallied other newspaper editors across the territory to cover the hearing. When they rolled into Cheyenne, the territorial capital sprawled before them in a chaos of new construction and established wealth. The legislature met in a grand building of brick and stone, ostentatious in its declaration of authority, and Naomi felt her stomach clench as they approached. They'd rented rooms at a modest hotel, and that night they gathered to finalize their strategy. Naomi would speak first, presenting the economic argument. Then Rose would tell her story, followed by Clara, Sarah, and any others who felt strong enough to testify. They'd present their clothing designs and financial ledgers, demonstrating that the Haven was a legitimate business operation, not some den of vice. "Remember," Naomi said to the assembled women, "they're going to try to make you feel ashamed. They're going to use words like abandoned and fallen and unnatural. Don't let them. We have nothing to be ashamed of. We survived, and that's not a sin. It's a triumph." The hearing was scheduled for 10 the next morning. Naomi barely slept, her mind churning through everything that could go wrong. When dawn finally came, she dressed in one of her own designs, a perfectly tailored suit of dark blue wool with a crisp white shirt, practical and professional, and impossible to dismiss as frivolous. The other women dressed similarly, a wall of competence and dignity. The legislative chamber was packed when they arrived. Naomi recognized some faces from the newspapers: politicians, businessmen, a few clergy members whose presence made her stomach turn. But there were also supporters, women who'd traveled from across the territory to witness the hearing, and a handful of men who looked more curious than hostile. The chairman of the committee, a heavy-set man named Senator Blackwood with mutton chops and an expression of permanent disapproval, called the hearing to order. He read the proposed legislation aloud, his voice dripping with false concern for the moral welfare of the territory's women, and then invited testimony. The first speakers were predictably against them, a minister who thundered about the natural order and women's sacred duty to submit to male authority, a businessman who claimed the Haven was driving up labor costs by giving women ideas above their station, a supposed medical expert who argued that too much independence caused hysteria and nervous disorders in the female constitution. Naomi listened to it all with her hands clenched in her lap, her jaw tight with suppressed fury. Beside her, she could feel the other women vibrating with similar anger, but they stayed silent, waiting for their turn. Finally, Senator Blackwood called, "Miss Naomi Vale, if you wish to speak for the opposition." Naomi stood and walked to the front of the chamber, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. She faced the committee, 14 men sitting in judgment, and refused to let herself be small. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and clear, "my name is Naomi Vale, and I stand before you today as the founder and operator of Vale's Haven. I'm here to tell you why the proposed legislation isn't just unjust, it's economically foolish and morally bankrupt." A murmur ran through the chamber. Senator Blackwood's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "The Haven employs 32 people directly," Naomi continued, pulling out her ledger. "We pay over $3,000 annually in wages. We purchase supplies from 17 different territorial businesses, contributing another $2,000 to the local economy. We pay property taxes, business taxes, and territorial fees totaling $800 per year. Our clothing operation ships products to 23 states and territories, bringing outside money into Wyoming and establishing our territory as a center for quality garment manufacturing." She set the ledger on the table in front of the committee. "If you shut us down, you don't just displace 23 women and 7 children. You eliminate 32 jobs, collapse multiple supply contracts, and send a message to every female entrepreneur in the territory that her business can be destroyed on moral grounds rather than economic merit. Is that really the precedent you want to set?" "Miss Vale," Senator Blackwood said, his voice icy, "this hearing is not about economics. It's about the moral fabric of our society." "With all due respect, Senator, it's about both," Naomi interrupted. "Because the moral argument you're making is based on a lie. The lie that women need male guardianship to function, to make decisions, to contribute to society. The women at the Haven didn't abandon their families. They fled violence, abuse, and cruelty. They didn't reject marriage. They escaped men who saw them as property rather than partners." "Those are serious allegations," another senator said. "Do you have proof?" "I have testimony," Naomi said, "from women who are here today, ready to tell their stories under oath. Women who will describe exactly what they were running from and exactly what they found at the Haven. If you want proof, gentlemen, I'll give you proof." Senator Blackwood looked like he wanted to refuse, but the room was too full of spectators and journalists for him to dismiss the offer outright. "Very well. Let's hear these stories." Rose stood and came forward, and Naomi stepped aside to let her speak. Rose's voice shook at first, but it grew stronger as she described her marriage to Thomas Garrett, the beatings that escalated over 6 years, the terror of watching her husband turn his violence on their daughter. She showed the committee the documented medical records from Laramie, the physician's notes describing Lily's injuries. "I am not a vagrant," Rose said, her voice ringing through the chamber. "I am a mother who protected her child. I am a woman who chose life over death. And if you pass this law, you're telling every woman in this territory that her safety matters less than a man's pride." Clara spoke next, describing the auction in Dry Hollow, the way her father had sold her to pay his debts, the laughter of the crowd. Then Sarah, who'd been promised to a 60-year-old rancher when she was 17 and had run rather than submit. Then Marie, her voice barely above a whisper, as she described her stepfather's predatory attention. By the time the fourth woman finished speaking, half the spectators were crying. Even some of the senators looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact. "These women," Naomi said, stepping forward again, "are not aberrations. They're not unusual. They're representative of thousands of women across this territory who suffer in silence because they have no alternative. The Haven gives them an alternative. It gives them dignity, purpose, and the radical possibility that their lives can be their own. If you shut us down, you're not protecting morality. You're protecting the right of men to abuse without consequence." Senator Blackwood's face had gone red. "You're being deliberately inflammatory." "I'm being honest," Naomi shot back. "Something this chamber seems to have trouble with." The hearing devolved into chaos after that. Blackwood tried to restore order, but the spectators were shouting questions. Journalists were scribbling furiously, and the committee members were arguing among themselves. Finally, Blackwood adjourned the hearing, promising a vote within the week. Outside the legislative building, Naomi and the other women were mobbed by supporters and journalists. Questions flew from every direction, and Naomi answered them as best she could, her voice going hoarse from repetition. Beside her, Rose held Lily close, and the little girl, who'd been terrified at the beginning of the hearing, now looked around with wide, wondering eyes at the crowd of people who'd listened to her mother's story and believed it. That night, back at the hotel, they waited anxiously for news. Theodore Finch arrived near midnight with early editions of the morning papers. The headlines were split. Vale's Haven exposes legislative overreach from one paper. Runaway women defend immoral settlement from another. But what mattered was that the story was everywhere, and the public response was overwhelmingly in their favor. Letters poured into the legislature over the next 3 days. Women from across the territory and beyond wrote to their representatives, demanding the bill be defeated. Business owners who relied on the Haven's contracts threatened to withdraw support from any legislator who voted for the ban. Even some churches split on the issue, with younger ministers arguing that protecting the vulnerable was a moral imperative that superseded traditional authority structures. When the vote finally came, the bill failed by a margin of 3 votes. It was closer than Naomi would have liked, but it was enough. The Haven would survive. They returned to the valley triumphant but exhausted, greeted by the women who'd stayed behind with celebration and relief. That night they held a feast in the communal hall, and for the first time in months, Naomi allowed herself to truly relax. Talon found her later, sitting alone on the porch of her cabin, watching the stars wheel overhead. "You did it," he said quietly, settling beside her. "We did it," Naomi corrected. "All of us." "True enough." Talon was quiet for a moment, then said, "There's something I need to tell you. Letter came while you were in Cheyenne. From Dry Hollow." Naomi's stomach clenched. "My father?" "He's dead. Pneumonia, according to the letter. They found him in his house, been gone for nearly a week before anyone noticed." Naomi waited for the grief to come, for some kind of emotional response to the news that her father was dead, but all she felt was a distant, cold kind of nothing. "I should feel something, shouldn't I?" "Maybe," Talon said. "Or maybe you already did all your grieving years ago, for the father you needed and never had." That felt true. Naomi had mourned her father long before he died, mourned the man he could have been, the parent she'd deserved, the love she'd never received. His actual death was just a formality, the universe catching up to what her heart had already accepted. "There's more," Talon continued. "He left the house to you. Only thing of value he had. It's yours if you want it." Naomi thought about the cramped, mean house in Dry Hollow, about the rooms where she'd learned to make herself small, and the table where she'd gone hungry while her father drank. She thought about everything that house represented: shame, submission, worthlessness. "Sell it," she said. "Take the money and put it into the Haven School Fund. Let something good come from it." Talon nodded. "I'll handle it." They sat in comfortable silence after that, and Naomi felt something settling inside her, some final piece of her old life sliding into place so the new one could fully emerge. She'd spent so many years defined by what she was running from. Now, finally, she could define herself by what she was running toward. The seasons turned. The haven continued to grow, adding new buildings, new businesses, new women seeking the freedom to build their own lives. Naomi's clothing designs evolved, and soon they were producing not just work clothes but fine garments for special occasions, wedding dresses for women marrying on their own terms, mourning clothes for those who'd lost what they'd loved. Rose's daughter Lily started school and proved brilliant at mathematics. Clara married one of the ranch hands who'd come to work for Talon, a quiet man who treated her like spun glass and made her laugh. Sarah took over the business operations entirely, freeing Naomi to focus on design and expansion. Marie became the valley's blacksmith, her forge producing tools and hardware that were sought after across the territory. And Naomi herself changed in ways both subtle and profound. The frightened girl who'd stood in the dry hollow square was long gone, replaced by a woman who commanded rooms without raising her voice, who built empires with needle and thread, who'd discovered that strength wasn't about being hard. It was about being unbreakable. 3 years after the legislative hearing, on a crisp autumn morning, Naomi stood in the center of the haven's main square and looked around at everything they'd built. The settlement had become a town, complete with a post office, a general store, a boarding house for visitors, and a chapel where weddings and memorials were held without any man presuming to speak for the divine. Nearly 40 women called it home now, along with their children and the handful of men who'd proven themselves allies rather than masters. Talon came to stand beside her, his hair showing more silver now, but his frame still strong and his eyes still sharp. "Thinking deep thoughts?" he asked. "Thinking about how far we've come," Naomi said. "How different everything is from that day in Dry Hollow." "You built something remarkable here," Talon said. "Changed lives, changed the territory, probably changed the world a little bit too." "We built it," Naomi corrected, taking his hand. Over the past 3 years, their relationship had deepened from friendship into something more, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the kind of love that didn't demand ownership. "You gave me the space to become who I was meant to be. All I did was open a door, you walked through it." Naomi squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses that matched her own. "I'm thinking about expanding," she said, "opening another haven, maybe up north near the Montana border. There's women up there who need what we've built." Talon smiled. "Of course you are. Can't ever just be satisfied with what you've got, can you?" "Why should I be? There's still so much work to do." Naomi looked around the square again at the women going about their daily business, free and purposeful and entirely themselves. "Every woman who shows up here proves that what we're doing matters. And as long as women need a place to escape to heal, to become strong, we'll be here." A rider appeared at the valley's entrance, a young woman on a tired horse, and Naomi recognized the slump of her shoulders, the way she held herself like she was trying to take up less space. She'd seen that posture before, in Clara, in Rose, in the mirror 3 years ago. "Looks like we've got another arrival," Talon said. Naomi was already moving, walking across the square to greet the newcomer. The young woman dismounted clumsily, nearly falling, and Naomi caught her arm to steady her. "Welcome to Vale's Haven," Naomi said gently. "You're safe here." The woman looked up, and her eyes were full of the same desperate hope Naomi remembered from her own journey. "I heard there was a place," she said, her voice breaking. "A place where women could start over." "There is," Naomi said. "And you found it." She helped the woman down and called for Clara to bring water and food. As she guided the newcomer toward the communal hall, Naomi caught sight of her reflection in the window of the general store. The woman looking back was strong and solid, with shoulders that didn't slump and eyes that didn't flinch. Her hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and she wore trousers of her own design and a shirt that fit her properly, proclaiming without words that she took up exactly the space she was meant to occupy. Naomi Vale had been offered up like livestock in a dusty square, had been told her whole life that she was worth less than the food she ate, had been taught to shrink and silence herself until she barely existed. But that girl was gone, burned away by the hard journey south and the harder work of building something from nothing. In her place stood a woman who'd created refuge from desperation, who'd turned shame into strength, who'd transformed the radical act of choosing herself into a community that would outlast her. A woman who'd proven that sometimes the greatest courage wasn't in fighting battles, but in simply refusing to surrender. In standing up and saying clearly and without apology, "I deserve better." The sun set over Vale's Haven, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson. In the communal hall, women gathered for the evening meal, their voices rising in laughter and conversation. Children played in the courtyard, safe and loved. The forge rang with the sound of hammer on metal, creating tools for building and defending and growing. And Naomi Vale, who'd once believed she was worthless, stood at the center of it all and knew with absolute certainty that she'd built something worth fighting for. Something that would endure long after she was gone, a testament to the simple revolutionary truth that women didn't need rescuing. They needed respect, opportunity, and the freedom to choose their own paths. She'd found that freedom in a valley where no one told her she was too much or not enough. And now, every day, she helped other women find it too. That was legacy enough for anyone.